I had her wrists zip-tied before she finished translating my own colonel's question back to him, and I remember thinking it was almost too easy. She'd come through Korath Crossing twice before, riding the cab of the coalition supply trucks, a laminated badge on a lanyard, and a notepad she never seemed to put down. Civil Affairs Liaison, the manifest said, a linguist attached to the convoy escort, there to smooth over checkpoints like ours, with polite phrases and patient eyes. The third time, my commander decided the convoy wasn't passing without a toll, and I decided she wasn't worth the trouble of being polite to. "Tell your colonel the road's closed," I said, and when she opened her mouth to answer in his own dialect, smooth as water, I knocked the notepad out of her hand instead of listening. "We don't need the typist talking for him. We need him talking." She didn't flinch. She watched the notepad hit the gravel, watched me zip-tie her wrists in front of her own driver, and said nothing at all. My commander, Voss, laughed at that, said something about coalition contractors needing to learn their place on Korathi ground, and two of my men laughed with him, because that was the safest thing to do whenever Voss made a joke. I told my men to put her in the supply tent with the other civilians, and forget about her. I wanted on record that I gave that order myself. She left the notepad where it had fallen. I noticed that later and didn't think anything of it at the time, that a woman who'd carried that notepad through 2 prior crossings without once setting it down would simply leave it in the gravel rather than reach for it with bound hands. I picked it up myself an hour after the shooting started, when there was no one left to ask permission from, and found pages of careful sketches that weren't translation notes at all. Elevation marks, sightlines from the ridge, the exact width of the gap in our wire, where the well drew the only foot traffic worth watching. 3 crossings worth of patient, unhurried reconnaissance, done in plain sight under a lanyard none of us had bothered to read twice. 40 minutes later, the Ashgate faction hit the crossing from the ridge above the river, and the men I'd posted to watch that ridge were already dead. The first rounds came in low and fast, stitching the checkpoint sandbags before the alarm even cleared anyone's throat. My commander, Voss, was the first one moving, toward the vehicles, not toward the fight. I watched him go, watched 2 of my own cousins go down trying to reach the gun truck, and understood in the space of about 4 seconds that the Ashgate fighters hadn't come to take the crossing. They'd come to wipe out everyone holding it, supply tent included. I was reloading behind a collapsed sandbag wall when she came out of that tent at a dead run, hands free, the zip tie hanging cut and useless from one wrist. I didn't see how she'd done it. I only saw that she had a fallen rifle in her hands inside 3 strides, and that she moved like the ground belonged to her. She didn't waste a round. I'd spent 4 years on that ridge and never seen anyone fire that economically. 2 shots, 2 Ashgate gunners down off the embankment, and she was already moving to the next angle before the bodies finished falling. No shouting, no wasted motion. She dragged my wounded corporal behind the water tank with one arm, while she covered the gap with the other, and when I shouted at her, I don't even remember what I shouted. Something about getting down, something stupid. She answered without looking at me. "Cover the south wire. They're trying to flank the well." I covered the south wire. I didn't ask myself until much later why I obeyed a woman I'd zip-tied 40 minutes earlier. The fight ran long and ugly. Ashgate had brought more men than a border crossing should ever see, and they kept coming in waves timed to our reload windows, which told me someone on their side had watched us for weeks. We were losing the wire by the time she pulled a flat radio out from under her jacket. Not coalition issue, something smaller, older, built to be missed in a pat-down, and started talking into it, in clipped phrases that weren't Korathi or English either. Coordinates, a time hack, a call sign I didn't understand yet. Vellum Hawk requesting fire support, grid is transmitted, danger close, authenticate Romeo 9er. I thought she was bluffing. I thought it until 4 minutes later, when something came in low over the ridgeline that wasn't one of ours, and wasn't one of theirs, and the Ashgate position on the high ground simply stopped existing. The silence afterward had a weight to it. My remaining men stared at the smoke instead of the wire, which is exactly the kind of mistake that gets you killed, except this time it didn't, because she was already moving again, already pulling the corporal's tourniquet tighter, already calling out which direction the survivors would come from. It wasn't luck. I understood that even then, watching her work. Luck doesn't know your terrain that well. Luck doesn't call a grid square from memory without checking a map. She'd walked this crossing twice before in that lanyard and notepad, and she hadn't been making small talk with the drivers. She'd been mapping the ridgeline, the dead ground, the well, the exact spot where a flanking force would have to bunch up to get through the wire. 3 visits. 3 quiet reconnaissance passes wearing a badge that said linguist, and not one of us had looked past it. A second wave came around the south side, maybe 10 minutes after the first, 6 men trying to cross the dry wash where the wire sagged lowest, the same gap her sketches had circled twice. She'd already told me to cover it before they moved, before there was anything to see, like she'd written the script for their attack before they'd thought to run it. I held the angle she'd given me and watched 4 of the 6 go down to fire that wasn't mine, called in from somewhere up the slope, where she'd apparently put a second set of eyes I never knew we had. The last 2 turned and ran back toward the wash, and she let them go. I asked her about that afterward, why she hadn't finished it. She said running men don't shoot straight, and dead men don't tell their commander the crossing held. She wanted Ashgate's survivors carrying that story home more than she wanted 6 more bodies on the wire. Voss didn't come back. He'd run for the lead vehicle the moment the shooting started and the vehicle was gone, and gone with it was the only man at that crossing who outranked her in my mind, the only man whose orders I still felt obligated to follow. I found out 3 days later, from the debriefing officer, that Voss had made it less than half a mile down the river road before his own driver put a round through the windshield and left him in the ditch. Ashgate's price for a commander who couldn't hold a checkpoint his own family had bled to keep. I felt nothing when I heard it. I'd already stopped thinking of him as a man whose orders mattered by the time the second wave broke. I was on one knee behind the water tank with a graze across my forearm and a corporal who wasn't going to make it without real medicine, and she was the only person left standing who knew what to do about either fact. She knelt down across from me to look at the corporal, and that's when I finally saw her hands clearly, steady, sure, already opening a kit that hadn't come from any aid station I recognized. She worked on him without a word to me, packing the wound, calling out vitals to no one in particular, like she was dictating a report she'd write later, and I sat there with my rifle across my knees and watched the woman I'd called a typist save the life of the man who'd helped me drag her into that supply tent. Her hands never shook, not once, not even when the corporal's breathing went shallow and I thought we were about to lose him. She just changed what she was doing with the same flat patience she'd used to call the fire mission, like panic was a tool she'd simply never been issued. Why? I finally asked her, and I didn't finish the question, because I didn't know which part of it I wanted answered. Why she'd come back for him, why she hadn't left us to the wire, why she'd let me put a zip tie on her in the first place, when she clearly could have broken it in front of me at the checkpoint, instead of waiting for a better reason. She glanced at me, just once, while her hands kept working. I needed your commander to think the convoy was harmless. He's not anymore my problem. You are, until that bleeding stops. That was the whole answer I was going to get, and it was enough. The coalition quick reaction team came up the river road 20 minutes after the fire mission, moving like they already knew the ground, which I understood by then, they probably did, because she'd likely walked them through it on that same flat radio, while I was still bleeding into my sleeve. Their lead vehicle commander called her by a name that wasn't on any manifest I'd ever seen stamped at that crossing. Vellum Hawk. The same words she'd spoken into the radio, said now like a rank instead of a code. He didn't ask her what had happened. He looked at the dead on the ridge, looked at the corporal breathing steady on a litter, and waited for her to tell him what came next. I expected to be put face down in the gravel. I had, after all, zip-tied an embedded intelligence officer in front of witnesses and called her a typist while doing it. Instead, she walked over to where I was sitting against the water tank, looked at the rifle still in my hands, and held out her own hand for it. I gave it to her without thinking twice. It felt like the only honest thing left to do. You held the south wire, she said. That's the part of today I'm putting in my report. She didn't say it kindly. She didn't say it as forgiveness either. She said it the way you'd note a fact on a page, and then she turned and walked toward the litter team without waiting to see what I did with it. What I did was kneel, not because anyone told me to, and not because I had a weapon left worth surrendering. They'd already taken that. I knelt in the gravel next to the cut zip tie still lying where it had fallen that morning, because it was the only gesture left that matched the size of what I'd just watched, and because some debts get paid in the only currency a man like me still has. They processed me as a detainee 3 days later. I told the debriefing officer everything I'd seen at that crossing, including the part where I'd called her a typist, and meant it as an insult, because it felt important that the record have both halves of that day in it, what I'd assumed about her, and what she'd actually been doing while I assumed it. The officer asked me twice if I was certain about the radio traffic, the call sign, the grid coordinates I'd half heard over gunfire. I was certain. A man remembers the exact words of the moment that proves him wrong for the rest of his life, whether he wants to or not. I don't know what became of the file. I know what became of me. I work now for the same coalition reconstruction office that rebuilt the bridge at Korath Crossing, translating for engineers instead of gunmen, and I have never once knocked a notepad out of anyone's hands. When a new contractor comes through with a badge and a lanyard and doesn't say much, I make a point of asking what she's writing down. Most of the time it really is just translation notes. I ask anyway. It costs nothing, and I've learned what it costs not to. I think about her notepad more than I think about the fire mission, honestly. 3 visits worth of careful, patient notes, written in the open, under a badge none of us bothered to question, while we decided who deserved our respect, before they'd done a single thing to earn our contempt. I was wrong about her in 4 seconds at that checkpoint, and it took a war for me to find out how wrong. She never raised her voice to tell me so. She didn't have to. The last thing she said to me, before the litter team carried the corporal off, and the quick reaction vehicles pulled out toward the river road, wasn't really meant for me at all. She said it to the corporal, low, checking his pulse one more time before she let him go. "You're not done yet. Neither am I." I think about that more than anything else from that day. Not the fire mission, not the silence on the ridge, not even the moment I went down on my knees in the gravel. Just that one line, spoken to a dying man who needed it more than I did, and true anyway, for the rest of us standing there, who'd spent a war deciding who got to be more than what we assumed they were.